Hello, my name is Marc Wittmann. I'm presenting to you a talk together with my co-contributors, three students from the University of Freiburg, Felix, Scheck, Julika, Feldmann and Amelie Glaesmann, and Julia Mossbridge and Daryl Ben. So what I'll be talking today is about the retroactive priming task by BEM, experiment 4 in his seminal paper from 2011. And what was it about? So it was about choice response times to emotional photos, which could be a positive, negative, which were affected by emotional words, positive, negative, appearing seconds after a response, after the choice reaction time. So the question then was, wow, how is that possible? Is this a causal psi effect from the future? So what we did now was a replication study in German language, and I'll present two studies on this, where I'll have confirmatory hypothesis, which we looked at, and of course also did some explorative testing post hoc. And in study 1, we used the retroactive priming task I'll be talking about shortly. And in study 2, next to the retroactive priming task, we had a sham control task. And I also talk about what this is. In addition to the usual analysis, we had some novel analysis to look at some potential interference effects which might be involved in these results. And we also did then a post hoc analysis of response times, which will reveal some suggestions for future studies. So first of all, what is the classic anterograde priming task? So no psi yet. What you have to do in a choice reaction time is you see either positive or negative photos, and you have to react to them by pressing two buttons. And then there is a prime before that, a word that is again either positive, negative. And if prime, the word, and the following photo are congruent in valence, so positive, positive, or negative, negative, the reaction time will be faster than if we have an incongruent condition of prime and photo. So that's the classic priming task, which has led to some interesting discoveries, also then called theoretically that the new unconsciousness, because everything goes so fast that we have no control over these reaction times. Now, the retrograde psi priming task is the following. Again, we have photos we have to react to either positive or negative. But then after the button press, a word appears, again, either positive or negative in valence. And here suddenly what is found is that even here again, we have this congruent versus incongruent effect, that the following, if the word following the photo is congruent, reaction time is faster than if it's incongruent. But why? How can this happen? Because the word is following after the button press. So this could be a this could be a psi effect, which we want to furthermore explore. So Daryl Ben in 2011 had this seminal paper where he showed in 8 out of 9 different experiments that, or tasks, that he had retroactive influences, so coming from the future a few seconds to minutes away. And this were in 8 out of 9 cases statistically significant. And we will be looking at experiment 4, the retroactive priming task. And then there were meta-analysis concerning this retroactive priming task. And in these meta-analysis with 15 specifically retroactive priming tasks, we find a positive, significant effect with a small effect size, but significant. Okay, we could say, okay, meta-analysis, all good, we have an effect, hooray. But there is some criticism, as we all know, and maybe one can summarize these criticisms into 2 camps. One is psi effects are a priori possible, but there's still some criticism about meta-analysis in parapsychology, for example, very famous Wagenmarkers, claiming that already in individual experiments, there's poor design, errors in data collection, and publication bias. So what he's conclusion is meta-analysis conducted on a set of bias studies can only affirm the existence of that bias. But then there's also another type of criticisms where people say it's a priori impossible to get a psi effect. So very famous, the Reber and Alcock sentence, pigs can't fly. So if pigs can't fly, why should we do research on flying pigs? Yeah, because they cannot fly. Schwarzkopf, a little more elaborate, but still I think dogmatic, said, no matter how strong the statistical evidence, if the hypothesis is impossible, it must necessarily be false. I certainly will not be convinced of its existence by some implausible observations, no matter how significant the meta-analysis. Okay, that's of course not our attitude or our approach, and we're in favor of conducting well-designed control experiments, and that's what I now present to you. So talking about this task, so for short, I will call it the BEM task. Of course, it already existed before. Daryl BEM published his experiments. It's experiment 4 in his 2011 paper. And here's a sequence of events that happened to the subject sitting in front of a computer screen. So you first see for 1.5 seconds a photo from the Hubble telescope. Then you see a positive or negative photo until the button press, the choice reaction time is undertaken. Then there's for 300 milliseconds black screen. Then comes the positive negative word for 0.5 second. And then for another 1,000 seconds on the black screen. And then next trial starts again with the Hubble telescope. So that's the build-up of the experiment. So study 1. So we conducted this study in 2016 with 4 different experimenters. We had 100 subjects, the same amount of subjects as BEM had in his study, mainly students. And importantly is that we made a clarification of the psi nature of the task only afterwards. So they wouldn't start cognitively think about psi effects. And we had furthermore, a 45-minute battery of questionnaire and computer tests, all mainstream tasks, and the BEM task was the last one, the last 5 minutes. Then we had the 20 negative, 20 positive photos taken from the International Effective Picture System, then 20 negative, 20 positive German words, and we translated them from the original, had a comparison of 2 translators who agreed then on one version. We also had outlier analysis. So individual trials, which were too fast, faster than 250 milliseconds were eliminated, or too slow were eliminated. And we eliminated judgment errors. So when there was a positive photo, for example, from the IAPS, and they pressed negative, the subject, that was also discarded. And also subjects with at least 25% errors in their 40 trials would also be eliminated. So we have raw data per trial, that is the reaction time, that is one raw data, but also we have logarithmic transform, the natural logarithm reaction time. Why is this done? Because in reaction times, typically they are skewed and then we don't have a normal distribution, and with this logarithmic transformation, they are basically pushed back into a normal distribution. So we have then taken from this raw data a retroactive priming value per person, which refers to that the reaction time congruent should be faster than the reaction time on incongruent trials. Okay, so wow, here already first results, study 1, 91 subjects, confirmatory analysis. We find a tiny little effect of 6 milliseconds, and in one-sided test, this is not significant. So overall subjects, no effect. But now, looking at men and women differently, we had 42 men, and they, as you see here, have a positive effect of 32 milliseconds, which is both for the RP and the log RP value, both even on a 2-sided version of the significance t-test, significant. And women have a tendency for a negative test, which doesn't reach significance. And if you calculate men versus women, we again have a significant difference between men and women. Okay, so we find then a significant effect only for men. But now we looked at the question of, are there more influences in this task? So I just showed on the right, you see retrograde. This is the effect we looked at, the retrograde effect of the word backwards to the picture. But couldn't it be otherwise? There was is a potential criticism that the word from trial X would influence the following photo of trial X plus 1. So this would be a classic anterograde effect, and we looked also for this effect. So at anterograde, so classic effect on congruent trials and on incongruent trials, and the difference between these two groups of reaction times was 12 milliseconds, which was not significant. And there was also no difference between men and women in this anterograde priming effect. So there was a small correlation between the anterograde and the retrograde priming effect. So the larger the anterograde effect, the smaller the retrograde effect. So that would have been a plausible interference. But as you see, it's a very small negative correlation, and it is not significant. And there were also no difference between men and women. So summary, study 1. So confirmatory, we have no RP effect, retrograde priming effect, across all 91 subjects. But exploratory, we see a RP effect in men. And there is no disturbing anterograde effect, which is actually also a good quality feature. Okay, study 2, next one. What happens now? So 2 years later, between December 2018 and we started until November 2020, just before a next lockdown with 8 different experimenters, we had 190 subjects, 95 subjects conducting the, call it BAM task, and 95 subjects conducting a sham control task. I'll tell you more about it in a second. So again, everything stays the same now, only for this sham control task, instead of having the negative and positive words coming after the button press, we have now in each case a series of 7 O's coming. Otherwise, all the other features of the task were the same. So why did we do this? As you see here on the right, the classic retroactive priming task we had before with the words, and now second condition, intersubject condition, because other subjects did this second condition, we had the O's behind it. The system, nevertheless, will assign congruent and incongruent trials, because the system will still take negative and positive words it thinks, but behind it there are only these O's. So there will be an output for incongruent and congruent, but this is the sham control task, because in reality there is no emotional world behind it. So if there is then a positive effect, we know it's a sham or a false positive. So study 2 with all subjects. What happens here? We have the retroactive priming task, first of all. And what we see here is overall subjects, we have a the reaction time to the incongruent trials is smaller than to the congruent trials. And so we have a negative RP value, no, not the positive as we would have hypothesized, but now a negative one across all subjects, at least significant for the log RP value across all subjects. And in the sham control task, we have no effect. So there we didn't find a false positive, which is a good thing. So we have a positive effect in the psi task across all subjects, but only in the log RP version, and no effect in the sham control task. So study 2, explorative. So second part, of course, we also want to look now what is with men and women, because we had this effect in the first study. And here now, to our surprise, now we find that both men and women have this negative tendency. In the men, even approaching significance in the log RP, and in women also we have the negative value, which doesn't reach significance. That's and there's also no significant gender difference, and no, checked it again, no anterograde priming effect that would interfere with our results. So summary, study 2, we have a weak negative RP effect, log RP across all 93 subjects, with a null effect in the sham control task. So there's no false positive, and we have no anterograde disturbing effect. So now discussing these results. So first of all, if we're looking at confirmatory analysis, we have to say the psi hypothesis in both studies is rejected. So the hypothesis was that we find a significant positive retroactive priming effect for RP or log RP, which we didn't find. So it was no positive. But then explorative, what we found in study 1 was men have a significant positive RP effect. And in study 2 now we found there's a significant negative log RP effect in the other direction. Yeah? So smaller reaction times to incongruent than congruent trials. And there's no sham effect, which usually if you take the paper from Scheck and von Stilfried in Frontiers in Psychology, the interpretation would be there. If we have an effect in the main task, we have a true effect. Yeah? So no false positive. Okay, but the skeptic nevertheless probably will say, if we think about it, that we only have small and inconsistent effects, which are random variations of empirical samples, yeah, around a true zero value in the population, which then probably is that reaction times congruent are identical to reaction times incongruent, but only these empirical samples jitter a little around to the positive or negative. Yeah, but discussion 2, well, there are, of course, psi theories who are aware of these typical effects because they occur again and again. And so typically one could say, what I found is a typical pattern of results in experimental parapsychology, where we have regular deviations from zero. It's regular because we had it in each study, but these deviations are often not repeatable under controlled condition. And in further conceptualizations, there is actually this idea in the generalized quantum theory that we might have non-causal entanglement correlations appear in replications on different places of the correlation matrices. Yeah? So in study 1 and 2, we had an effect, but it jumped. The jump was apparent, but not systematic and repeatable. Okay, but discussion 3, but maybe we have a language effect. Could that be? So I just refer to this paper by Schlitz et al., which some sort of also appeared just beginning of this year. And what they showed with our retroactive priming task is that they had a significant positive RP effect for the English sample. But for other language samples, it was not significant, but they had a tendency for negative effects. So this could also be a language effect. Or, that's a question, this will be the last part now of my talk, is it all about culture? So what I talked about just up to now is now all content of the upcoming paper in the Psychology of Consciousness journal. And I will now talk about further post hoc analysis, which we continued. So discussion 4, have the effects of culture and time. So I have here now 6 different photos from the IAPS battery. And what you see is that they're very different. So on the left upper side, for example, you see something which I was not really clear what it was, something like tissues, cloths. And then we have this person in the middle, maybe on a trip, a bad trip. And on the right side, this is for me, let's say for a Central European person, it's like the depiction of a movie from the 80s. And down on the left, we have a golf player. Actually, this looks for me very much, I associate this now with Donald Trump. So this is a special effect. But again, you could say, oh, maybe in Central Europe, golf has not the same status of a recreational sport as it is in the US. And then we have the classic disgust photo and a very positive photo. And it's of course known that people using the IAPS battery very often do their own standardization, validation beforehand, because it is known that culture has an effect on our emotional evaluation of emotional pictures. So what did we do now? So we have the valence of the 40 photos, 20 negative, 20 positive. What we looked at now in the data I just showed you, the choice reaction time for each photo, which is the decision time. So if we have a fast reaction time, we can say, oh, we have a fast and clear identification of the photo. And we can also look at the number of judgment errors, negative, positive, to each photo, which would be a sign for accuracy of recognition. So what we then did for our 274 subjects for the 2 BEM tasks, the 1 sham control task, we searched for the 10 best negative and 10 best positive photos, which would have the fastest response time and the lowest number of judgment errors. So then we would have say, okay, now we have clearly identifiable photos for the subjects. And look now, what are the effects here? Okay, so we have a post hoc analysis now for the RP, for retroactive priming study 1, only these 20 best photos. And actually, if you look at this, there's not much difference to study 1. With all 40 photos, you see across all subjects, no effect. In women, we have again this tendency for a negative value, minus 25 milliseconds, which is from the p-value is a tendency. And the men again have this tendency for a positive effect, which is not significant in this case. But still overall, men positive, women negative, and overall they cancel themselves out. That's very similar to study 1 we had before with the 40 photos. Now study 2, now we get a different picture with the retroactive priming study 2. We see now for all subjects a mean of 19 milliseconds, which is significantly different from 0. In the women, we have is mainly driven by the women with minus 28 milliseconds, which is significant. And also the men have this tendency now for a negative effect, but it's too small to reach significance level. But here now, with let's say the best 20 photos, we get a significant effect, a negative effect. So we have the tendency for the women in study 1 for a negative effect. Now we have across all subjects, mainly driven by women, a negative effect in study 2. Okay, general discussion. I'm closing soon. So the original idea was the replication study to have it as close as possible for comparability with your other studies. Therefore, we just chose the same photos, but there might be language, time, and cultural differences. So either we validate a priori the IEPS photos for culture and language before we test now our, let's say, more Central European, or in this case, Freiburg students. Or we can also, of course, do a response time study for identification of the appropriate stimuli beforehand. So how I can close is that the diverse results are typical patterns of findings in experimental parapsychology, providing confirmation for skeptics. They say no confirmation, as well as confirmation for believers. Oh yeah, there is something in the data. And that's probably the next step, looking again at the same task, but with other identified stimuli, which are appropriate for Central European or Freiburg students. And I close with thanks to the experimenters who were mainly interns in my lab, and also Moritz Pischel, who did this reanalysis of the task. And thank you for listening, and I will be open for questions now.